Hello again and welcome to part 3 of History Boffing's South Africa playlist, where we're going to discuss a hugely significant process that took place in southeastern Africa in the early 19th century, the mfecane. In doing so, we'll ask whether the traditional view of what happened is to be believed and introduce the concept of orthodoxy versus revisionism in the historian's quest for truth. You'll recall from our first video on South Africa that the southeast of Africa was populated by the Bantu-speaking people, who were divided into strong tribal groups. Of these tribes, without a doubt the most well-known is the Zulu tribe, in part made famous through popular culture such as the TV series Shaka Zulu and the films Zulu and Zulu Dawn. While these TV representations are enjoyable, their portrayal of the Zulus is not wholly accurate and often exaggerated in some way for the purposes of entertainment. In fact, the history of the Zulus is far more complex, and we will only be considering a time span of a few decades in this video as we analyse an event that traditionally has been associated with the Zulu Empire. Once again, we'll not be covering every event and every tribe. Instead, we'll go over enough to ensure you have examples that help you understand the broader process of the mfecane. But first, let's backtrack to the early 19th century to 1816. The Zulu tribe is a small tribe of perhaps 2,000 people, and like several others is aligned with the larger Mwethwa tribe. The Mwethwa and their allies are in conflict with the Ndwandwe tribe, which has resulted from increased demand for land and food as populations have grown. This year, in 1816, the Zulu chief dies and one of his sons takes his place. This son, however, is not who the Mwethwa chief, Dingiswayo, wants to be leading the Zulus. Dingiswayo wants one of his generals, Shaka, to become chief. Shaka is a Zulu and the eldest son of the recently deceased chief, but as an illegitimate child, Shaka and his mother fled Zulu territory and sought refuge with Dingiswayo. As Shaka grew, he demonstrated both prowess in battle and loyalty to Dingiswayo. Thus, with the support of Dingiswayo, that same year Shaka returns to Zulu territory, kills his half-brother and assumes control of the Zulu tribe. As a formidable warrior and military strategist, there is no doubt that Shaka developed the Zulus as a fighting force. He had to do so quickly, too. For 1 year later, Dingiswayo, his overlord, was killed by the Ndwandwe's leader, Zwide. Seeking revenge, but also trying to combine the Zulus, remnants of the Mwethwa, and other enemies of the Ndwandwe into a coherent fighting force, Shaka at first pulled off a brilliant defensive victory at the Battle of Gokokli Hill, and then defeated a large Ndwandwe force at the Militarism River. Soon after, Shaka destroyed the Ndwandwe capital and Zwide died in exile. In this region, the Zulus are now the undisputed force, with a leader who understands the importance of military strength and possesses a system that develops it. We'll cover this militarism when we look at the Anglo-Zulu War in a later video. For traditional historians, this emergence of the Zulu Empire was the beginning of the mfecane, which roughly translates as crushing or scattering. Without a doubt, there are a series of internecine, in other words, between-tribe conflicts at this time, resulting in death and displacement. However, as our video explains, the blame for this process has somewhat unfairly been laid solely at the door of Shaka and the Zulus. Let's first of all consider the traditional view of the mfecane, in a nutshell and by no means covering all of the consequences. The Zulus expanded and defeated tribes such as the Ngwane, who were forced westwards. They, in turn, having witnessed Zulu tactics, now adopted them and used them to defeat other tribes who lived further west. These tribes, mainly the Tolokwa tribe but also others, in turn moved west into Boer territory and became slaves or servants to the whites, and were known as the Mantatees by the British and Boers. Some of the Ngwane turned south, and were it not for a British force defeating them in 1828, they might have caused further disruption. A group of Zulus that left Shaka the Ndebele also wreaked havoc, moving northwards and then westwards. Thus, according to the traditional view, once the dust had settled on the mfecane, what remained was a significant militaristic indigenous empire. Around it was depopulated land, which the Boers moved into through their Great Trek. Furthermore, what happened demonstrated to the whites that the barbarism of African tribalism was in need of civilizing. This was the prevailing opinion for the next 150 years until the work of Julian Cobbing challenged the view that the mfecane was Zulu-driven and a process solely generated by internal conflict in the Bantu-speaking tribes. Cobbing's earlier research has since been reworked by further academics, notably Elizabeth Eldridge. Let's now consider a different interpretation of the mfecane. There is no doubt that there were major internal changes in the Bantu-speaking region of South Africa, particularly amongst the Nguni people that included the Zulu, Mwethwa and the Gwandwe tribes. However, the first significant difference between the traditional and revisionist accounts relates to just how destructive the conflicts involving the Zulus and other tribes really were. While orthodox histories of the mfecane have relied heavily on missionary accounts that claimed hundreds of thousands had died through battle and starvation, and that cannibalism was rife, revisionists instead point to the large numbers of Bantu-speaking people who remained in areas after the mfecane had ended. Furthermore, revisionists point to several external factors caused by the whites that led to and prolonged the violence during the mfecane. The first revision to our history of the mfecane concerns land pressure. Due to the Portuguese introducing maize to South Africa, it is true that Bantu-speaking tribes did see increased population growth in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which would have led to increased conflict. However, this population pressure was exacerbated by Boer and British expansion. In 1820, the British moved the Xhosa further east and also evicted the Tembu tribe at the western fringe of the Bantu-speaking area. While well before the Great Trek, a mixed group of Cape-coloured and some whites, collectively known as the Griquas, had established a base well past the Orange River in Bloemfontein. Furthermore, these Griquas increasingly raided Bantu-speaking areas for cattle and slaves. The Griquas had, by the mid-1820s, reached Ngwane and even Ndebele land on their raiding sprees. Furthermore, to the northeast, Portuguese Mozambique was developing as a slave trading colony, and raids into Bantu-speaking land is claimed to have had a twofold effect. Some tribes moving to escape the raids, and others moving in order to capture people that could then be sold on. Then, as the Voortrekkers arrived in Bantu land, they wrongly and often deliberately claimed the areas as unpopulated in order to justify their land grab. Thus, we have two interpretations of the mfecane. This leads us nicely to consider a useful approach to writing essays, particularly for A-level and IB diploma programme students. It adapts Hegel's dialectic in order to provide a balanced evaluation of a historical event or process. By taking a thesis or traditional account and counterbalancing it with a revisionist antithesis, a student can then draw a balanced synthesis and draw conclusions. In the case of the mfecane, the thesis, the traditional account, is that the mfecane was internally generated, driven by the Zulu Empire, and devastating. The whites were oblivious, or at best bystanders, to the event. The radical view is that while there were internal changes and pressures that contributed to violence, it cannot be called a mfecane, a crushing, because the impact on population was not as great as traditionalists claim. Revisionists also view white actions as crucial in understanding the movement of Bantu-speaking tribes in the 1820s and 1830s. From these two somewhat opposing viewpoints, the student takes what they believe based on the evidence and creates a synthesis. In revisiting two revisionist works, We can consider Cobbing to be the original revisionist of the mfecane. His view was radical and laid blame for much of the violence at the door of the British, Boers, Griquas and Portuguese. However, while some of his arguments have been supported by subsequent historians, others have not, and we can view Eldridge's later work to be more of a synthesis, agreeing with Cobbing on the role of the Griquas, but discounting the role of the Portuguese slavers. This is the historical process at work. Revision, synthesis, revision once again, more synthesis, and so on. So what is our synthesis, and was the mfecane a myth? Well, there is no doubt that there was increased violence amongst Bantu-speaking tribes, and rivalry grew out of the pressures associated with population growth and good old-fashioned desire for power. The Zulus played their part, certainly at the beginning, but the notion that the Zulus drove such a major process with other tribes imitating their tactics in order to crush their own rivals should not ignore the part played by the whites in taking Bantu land and raiding the western areas of Bantu territory. Furthermore, there does not appear to have been a crushing on the scale claimed by the missionaries and commentators of the 19th century, and so using the word mfecane to describe this violent process is debatable. In fact, some historians, such as Norman Etherington, do not use the term. However, we should not whitewash the process as one that whites created and sustained, because to do so diminishes the politics and society of the Bantu-speaking region. As the Bantu-speaking people were capable of developing complex and cultured societies, so they were capable of the power-grabbing, political intrigue and war that the Europeans were. Ultimately, the mfecane, however you view it, had consequences that were to shape South Africa. Greater interaction between white and black, a drastically different looking map of the territories by the mid-19th century, and a white opinion of Bantu-speaking peoples, particularly the Zulu, that was to influence British and then South African policy for years to come. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe by pressing the red subscribe button below. You'll easily be able to find new videos to help you with your studies, but you can simply use these videos to enjoy and find out more about history.